thank you so much for joining us and for joining the ceremony which just ended. My name is Joel Carmel. I work for an organization called Breaking the Silence. I'm here basically to introduce my colleague, Becca Strober, who's going to be the speaker in this breakout room. Before she begins, I just want to make it clear that she'll be speaking for a few minutes, and then she'll open the conversation up to questions and to conversation. Having said that, we are only taking questions in the chat. Please do feel free to send us questions, comments throughout. I really ask, especially on this particular evening, to be respectful to each other and to us, and we'll try to answer as many people as possible. So without further ado, Becca Strober.
Hi all, thank you very much for coming. It's great to see so many people here. Right now we're 55 and growing. And I hope that you gained a lot from the ceremony if you just watched it. This is going to be a conversation in English. There is the same conversation happening in Hebrew by Nadav Weiman, if that's more comfortable for someone. And you can access the link on the page of Combatants for Peace. And there's also other chats that are happening also in Arabic. And what we're going to focus on in this room is the narrative of fear. And we're going to do that in two different ways. The first is that I'm going to ask you all some questions, and I would love to hear your answers. And I think more so than I would love to hear your answers, I think it would be great for everyone in the forum who feels comfortable to share with each other so that we can get the feeling of having a conversation through the chat. And as we go, I'm also going to share a little bit from my own personal experience of how I grew up on the narrative of fear and decided to put it behind me and work for peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So I'll just quickly say that I'm the Director of Education with the organization Breaking the Silence. And we're an organization of former soldiers who served in occupied territory. And I've been part of Breaking the Silence since 2018. And I think one of the main things that we do is we do educational work. We use the testimonies we've collected from soldiers in order to do educational work through presentations and tours to Hebron and to the South Hebron Hills. But when you really kind of dig down into what the work we do is, it's both showing the face of the occupation, what does it look like, but then also being able to, especially for Israelis, meet Palestinians who are living under occupation and hear from them once we have an understanding of what the system looks like. And so with that being said, I'm gonna kind of start us off, and I'm gonna ask the first question, and for everyone who feels comfortable, please share in the chat, and maybe I'll also pull some out once you share to kind of read aloud. And the question is, it's basic. What do you think, in a word or two, is one of the driving reasons for fear of the other, for fear of another person or another group of people? I'll give everyone about a minute to write. Fantastic. So thanks for everyone who shared and are continuing to share. And you're welcome to keep sharing until we get to the next question. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff that I see here. Not living with or speaking to the other, not knowing their language, ignorances of the reality of the other and therefore not understanding. Curiosity must come before fear. Knowing soldiers can crash into my home at any day or night. Believing stereotypes and preconceived notions. I'm actually going to jump on to what the very first person wrote, which was Amita Jarman. And Amita said, not knowing them personally. And I think it's something somewhat basic, but if I can kind of bring us a little bit into the narrative that at least I grew up in. I grew up in the United States. I grew up in Philadelphia. I'm 32 years old today, by the way. And I moved to Israel in 2007, and I joined the army and served as a lone soldier, which is someone who serves in the army who doesn't have immediate family in the country. And I'll kind of come back to that in a bit, but first and foremost, I grew up in Philadelphia. I grew up very strongly in the Jewish community. I went to Jewish preschool and I went to Jewish summer camp, and my dad was the president of the synagogue at one point, and we, spent some time there. And I grew up in a very Jewish-minded household and community. And a lot of those values that I learned were values that I hold tight until this moment, such as tikkun olam, fixing the world, right? And of course, that's a value that teaches us that we should be seeking and working for justice in the world. And I bring that up specifically now because I actually think in a lot of ways the narrative I grew up in, and of course I cannot speak for all American Jewish communities, I can only speak for myself, but the community that I grew up in, we were fairly progressive, and we were taught quite liberal values. And if anything, actually, we were taught to love the other, right? Love thy neighbor as thyself. Those were values that I grew up on. But on the other side of that, there was a complete separation between what we knew and the communities we lived in and who Palestinians, or even on a more general level, the Arab people were. And so growing up as a Jewish person in America, I knew I loved Israel, that I was taught. Of course, I grew up on the concept of the Holocaust. And I think actually the first fear that came, it wasn't a fear, if I'm 32, a lot of my friends here in Israel, when I was a child, were in the height of the Second Intifada. And for them, a lot of their fear was very physical. But growing up in America, the first fear that really came for me in this specific issue was separation. I had this concept that I knew who the other was, right? But in reality, I had no details of who they were. I had no concept of where Palestine was. Of course, I grew up looking at maps of Israel, but none of them had the green line on them. None of them had Gaza on them. And I grew up basically with no real concept as to what it means to be a Palestinian under the occupation. So what did I know? I knew that there was Israel, a land that my family's from. My grandmother was a Jerusalemite, that I loved, that I wanted to live in, that was important for the Jewish people to have safety. And there's a group of people who was trying to take that safety away, right? And so then the real fear that I felt, and that a lot of times I think would come up between me and my friends, was a fear of not having a place to go. And that's a fear that I think is kind of hard to deal with because it's very potential, right? It's not an actual threat that's happening tomorrow, but rather a general fear that we grew up in our community being worried about. And then I moved to Israel. And I think that moving to Israel when I was 18 when I look back on it, an incredibly interesting process for many reasons. But one of them was that that fear that I had became much more practical, right? Meaning I went through a process of very quick education in the first few years that I was here, how to hate Arabs. And it's not that that wasn't existing in some of my communities in the United States, maybe not purposefully, of course, but we didn't have any access to who Palestinians actually were. But in Israel, it was very of the moment, very practical. And I'll give an example. When I moved to Israel, I lived on a kibbutz up north. It's on the border of Lebanon. And at one point, the person who was in charge of our group living on the kibbutz, she was driving me and a friend back to the kibbutz, and it's in the north of Israel, and so there are a lot of Arab towns in the north of Israel. And my friend asked to be dropped off near one of these towns because she was meeting a friend. And the head of our group said, and I don't feel comfortable dropping you off here. There's a lot of Arabs here. I don't feel comfortable with this. And that was the thing, that taught me in that moment, here they're Arabs, therefore I should be afraid. Now I realize that sounds basic, maybe, but when you're 18, you're about to enlist into the army, and you have, someone who you look up to, who's been living in this country for so long, you jump on those examples. And that's exactly the mindset that I had then enlisting into the army. And I'm going to pause before I start about the next part of kind of me in the army and how that, I think, fear really took hold and what it means to be a soldier and what we do with that fear. To ask all of you, kind of, is there a moment in which you felt that you were taught to fear? I think, it's a pretty common thing. It's something we all go through in one moment or another. It doesn't have to specifically be about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, just any moments. Give a few more seconds. So, and I'll just share maybe kind of a few things that people said. My immigrant parents taught me to fear goyim, or meaning non-Jews in America, but I rebelled against it because I knew them and they were friendly. I grew up in Toronto, Canada, and as a child was beaten up for being Jewish, and that was grade 4. Other instances later in life as well. I grew up in the UK, and I was never explicitly told this, but I think there was innate fear of people from outside the Jewish community. And the first person who shared, which again I'm going to jump on, was I was told not to wear a kippah outside because there were Arab people living in our neighborhood. And I think a lot of the examples here are really interesting, and they're really good examples of moments in which we were taught to fear, because often the concept of being taught to fear, there is some base in reality, right? Meaning there are examples of reasons why we should be fearful, why we should be smart. But when we then take it and generalize it on a whole entire population, it makes it very hard to work towards change, to work towards peace. And I think one of the things that eventually brought me to breaking the silence and brought me to working against the occupation was recognizing my own place in instilling that fear, in instilling that separation between people on the other side and the way I viewed them, or we viewed them, or my soldiers viewed them. And I started off by mentioning the head of my group, who she taught me kind of fear. She taught me fear based in racism. But I actually then joined the army, and I did the same exact thing to my soldiers. And when I was in the army, I served between the years of 2008 and 2010, and I served as a shooting instructor. And I worked mainly with infantry soldiers. I taught probably upwards of 2,000 infantry soldiers. And infantry soldiers, after going through somewhere between 8 and 14 months of training, often find themselves in occupied territory. May it be in the West Bank or on the fence with Gaza. Not everyone, but a fair amount of them. And one of the things that's interesting about the way that we view in the army, when we are in occupied territories, the way that we view the local population that we're occupying, that we're policing, we have two definitions for them in the army. And those two definitions are involved and uninvolved, meaning every single person in the Palestinian population is involved in terror or uninvolved in terror. And it doesn't matter if you're a 2-month-old child or a 16-year-old boy or a 25-year-old woman or an 80-year-old grandpa. You're involved in terror or you're uninvolved in terror. And if you're involved in terror, then of course it's the army. We know what to do with that. But if you're uninvolved in terror, what we're basically teaching our soldiers, and the way that we see it in occupied territories, is this person's still a potential threat, right? That's kind of the mindset that we have as soldiers in the occupied territory. And the day-to-day jobs that we're doing quite resemble policing. And so when we talk about this concept of fear, the definition itself is fearful. This person, we don't have any information that they're involved in terror, but we're still looking at them that they could potentially be, right? If not now, then in the future. And I look back a lot on this definition for two reasons. The first is because no one's innocent. There is no such thing in army lingo as just being a totally innocent Palestinian, right? And think about how much that strengthens our fear. And the other why I've spent a lot of time thinking about this concept is because as a shooting instructor, I realized how much I taught them to think in that way. And I wasn't the only one, right? There's a whole entire education system beforehand. But today I look back on it in 2021, and I know I participated in that system. And I'll give a few examples of how. I mentioned I taught close to 2,000 infantry soldiers. And as I would teach infantry soldiers, we would wear what's known as half bits. You have a nice army clothes and you have like day-to-day army clothes. And day-to-day army clothes are known as bet or B, meaning like the less nice uniform. And we wore chetzi bet. And chetzi bet is half bet. It means you're wearing army pants, but you're wearing a shirt. And the shirts that we would get were passed down to us by the shooting instructors who came before us. And so I would walk into a shooting range, and in front of me would be a soldier. Often he would be in advanced training, which means he would be about 4 months into the army and about 4 months before heading into his job, perhaps in occupied territory, often so. And I would teach him one of 4 things. I would teach him regular shooting or sharpshooting, which is the slightly farther ranges, or I would teach him the Negev, which is a small machine gun, or a machine gun. And I'm almost even today embarrassed to say this, but I would walk into the shooting ranges and the shirts that we wore said things like, every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. And on that shirt, under those words would be a target. And you would see the target as though it was a scope, as though you're looking through an army scope, a gun scope. And there would be a person's body falling to the ground. And that's the shirt that I wore when I taught my soldier how to use his gun. Another shirt we wore was the same type of target, and it would say, 1 shot, 1 kill. And at the time, I knew that it's not totally cool, right? I remember thinking to myself, my mom came to visit from Philadelphia, and I remember hiding those shirts at the bottom of my closet so she wouldn't see them. So there's a part of me in there that knew that it's dehumanizing, but at the same time, it's so cool that my commander passed down those shirts to me, Becca, for doing a good job, right? That's wasach, that's something cool. And I'll share another moment, that's just generally. But I remember one moment teaching soldiers, and we would do this a lot. I mean, when you are teaching soldiers how to shoot, you're constantly saying fire, in Hebrew, esh. And that means shoot, right? Fire, they shoot the gun. Fire, they shoot the gun. But when you're doing that day after day after day, that gets boring. And because it gets boring, you do something else. And I remember at one point standing there, and one very specific memory, and I thought of all of the names of terrorists that I knew. I mean, big name terrorists, like Osama bin Laden. I said Osama bin Laden, and the soldier shot. And I said another terrorist name, and the soldier shot. I said another terrorist name, and the soldier shot. And that's it. I ran out of names. I didn't know that many people. And I said at the time, Mahmoud Abbas. And for those who don't know, Mahmoud Abbas is the Palestinian president. And he shot. And then I ran out of names. And so the next name that I said was Mickey Mouse. And the soldier turned around to me with these huge eyes and he said, "You want me to shoot Mickey Mouse?" And I said, "No, not really. I don't want you to shoot Mickey Mouse. I just ran out of names." And we laughed and we moved on. And I thought about that recently because at that same moment that soldier was so surprised, how could I say Mickey Mouse? And I look back and I say, how could I say Mickey Mouse? But neither of us blinked an eye. Neither of us blinked an eye when we talked about shooting the Palestinian president. And that whole time, I'm wearing a shirt that says, 1 shot, 1 kill. And so then when we talk about soldiers going into occupied territory and seeing Palestinians as involved or uninvolved, someone asked, it's moravim or bilti moravim in Hebrew. I think it's important that we understand we're not just talking about a military term, right? We're not just talking about a way that the army decided to find something, but rather a natural progression of how over time we teach ourselves to see the other. And that's by not seeing them. That was, I think one of the things, and maybe then I'll move on to the next thing, but one of the things that I think is so interesting about that time period was that whole time I saw myself who's someone who wanted peace, who cared about peace, who cared about the other. But it goes back to that concept of when you have no idea what the other is going through, what the conflict means for them, what living under occupation means to them, it's so easy to walk into a shooting range and joke about, killing whomever, or put on a shirt that makes every single person in your scope seem like a terrorist. And at the same time, you know, I remember 2009, I voted Meretz, you know, who is the most liberal Zionist party. And that's where this concept of separation is so important. Because when did this change? It changed after I got out of the army. I got out of the army, I became a civilian, and I started talking to people. I started talking to Palestinians in my class. They were Palestinian citizens of Israel, they're citizens of the country. We were both studying at Tel Aviv University. And I started hearing other stories. I started volunteering for an organization that was Jewish and Palestinian women together. I kind of fell into it, but I connected with it. And from there, I started working for an organization called Gisha, which focuses on the freedom of movement, the human right of the freedom of movement, and specifically in and out of Gaza. And that's something that that Israel is very much responsible for, who can travel in and out of Gaza. And instead of there being a situation in which we think we can travel freely, and I think we all know from Corona how much we haven't been able to travel this year and how difficult that's been, and sometimes even the feeling, if you live in Israel at least, of not being able to leave the country, the hardship that's come with that, the fear, the sadness, the not knowing. And in that time in 2013, when I was working at Gisha, I had like a desk job. I was a very unimportant person in that organization, and I would answer the phone and I would pass the people that I was talking to, I'd pass them on to the intake coordinators who would help people. It was a legal center. But I started talking to people, and sometimes you would have the same person call over and over again, and then we would check in, we would talk, right? And so, for example, there was a woman who was accepted to study in Europe, to study in college. She was my age. I was studying. There's no problem for me to study. If I wanted to go study in Europe, I had done it earlier that year. I went over the summer and did a program abroad. But in order for her to study in Europe, she had to get an okay from the Israeli government to pass from Gaza to the West Bank, and from there to Jordan, so she could fly to Europe. That was one example. You know, other people who would call me would talk about wanting to be reunited with their family. Either one of them was in Gaza and one of them was in the West Bank, or one was in Gaza and one was in Israel or abroad. And all of these cases required help. And, you know, I thought about it a lot, but okay, that's what's going on. And the phones would ring off the hook. I think the whole time I worked there, I don't remember a single day that the phones from the beginning of the day to the end of the day weren't just off the hook. And I remember the moment that came to an abrupt end, and it was Protective Edge. It was the 2014 operation in Gaza. And after every single day of there being phone calls, you know, what's going on with my file? Can you help me? Who should I talk to? Some of the people I couldn't really talk to because they didn't speak English and I don't speak Arabic, and I just passed them on. But phone call, phone call, phone call. Protective Edge started, and within a few days, how many phone calls were there? 0. And I remember thinking to myself, as all of this is going on, there's that student in Gaza who wants to go study in Europe, and she's stuck in Gaza right now, and there are bombs. And I can't do anything to help her. And that's just one person. There's other people who want to be reunited with their family, and no one can go anywhere. And if we kind of bring it back to this concept of fear, to be honest, that was the first time that I had specific stories about specific people who lived in the occupied territories. That was the first moment that I knew who the other was. And when you realize who the other is, you realize you can't just keep going. You realize You know, for me, that was a moment in which today I work at Breaking the Silence, and we love to break silence. But at that exact moment, those few weeks of there being no phone calls was the loudest silence that I've ever heard. And that was the moment when I decided that from this moment on, I'm going to be an activist. I'm going to talk to Palestinians. I'm going to meet Palestinians. I'm going to work with them because we have a shared destiny and because I need to do everything possible to lessen the fear and break that barrier and separation. And that's a little bit of my story. And I want to end also for all of you with a question and continuing in the chat, not end, but kind of end my part at least, which is, what are the ways, having heard the ceremony from your own life experience, maybe something you've done in the past, what are the ways that you think that we can break down fear and separation? And I'll give everyone about a minute to answer.
If anyone would like to speak physically and have their voice heard in this conversation, other than in the chat, I'm inviting you to raise your hand, which is something that you can do. If you see at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says reactions, and one of the options there is raise hand. If you'd like to contribute to the conversation by speaking, then please raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Hi, my name is David. I am currently in Jerusalem, and I've been struggling a lot with this idea of fear. I see it a lot on the Jewish side, and from what I've heard in the ceremony, there's also a lot of fear on the Palestinian side of the army and the Jew, and because we don't know each other, it's so easy to generalize and to make this kind of caricature of each other. And I think, yeah, the only way to bridge it is to meet. But even to meet, one has to overcome the fear. And I don't know how to overcome this initial, like, how do you push yourself over the edge to say, how do I break this block in the dam of fear that prevents me from meeting the other because I'm so afraid of the other, because of the caricature? That's something I don't know the answer to.
I'm happy to kind of try and give some sort of an answer or think through it with you, Avi. And I think also if anyone else is interested in saying their thoughts, that would be great. I can say personally, you know, you're incredibly right. You know, both sides are incredibly fearful, and then how do we break through to get there? You know, maybe I'll add in, you know, one of the things I've noticed, I've been kind of crossing the green line. I've been an activist since about 2014. And I can't tell you the amount of people I've met, especially kids, though not exclusively, who the only Israelis, and maybe I think probably only Jews also that they've met, though of course they're not necessarily one and the same, but the only Israelis that they've met have either been settlers who have been violent towards them, of course not all settlers are violent, but specifically ones who have been violent towards them, and the army. Who is either, the army either at a checkpost or sometimes during those violent interactions. And of course, that's not all that is going on here. But when I think about it in those terms, I think like, wow, that's such a, that's so crazy. That's such a specific perspective. And also, for Israelis and Palestinians, often for Israelis, the separation means we're not meeting any Palestinians. But for Palestinians, they're still meeting the occupation. They're still meeting Israelis, but not necessarily Israelis who are interested in working together, right? And not even dialogue. I mean, I think working together is even past dialogue. But and as for how to get through it, I think part of it is it's always going to take an initial moment of bravery or of hope. I think it's a combination of feeling hope and responsibility, rather than there might also be fear there. There might also be shame there. I think there's a lot of feelings. They're all legitimate, but understanding that we're also people who can pause or end the cycle. And specifically, David, I would love to, after this, send you specifically some programs that you can join if you're in Jerusalem physically, technically right now, in which you can meet Palestinians. Ilan Kirschenbaum, I saw that you just wrote about a life-changing event, and maybe you'd like to share it with everyone and turn your microphone on. Yeah? Jojo, yeah, great.
Yes, so when my youngest son was born, he was born in a bad shape, and he was in Schneider Hospital. It's a children's hospital in Israel. And there was a Palestinian grandfather with his grandson at the same time. And we began speaking to one another, and the experience was very intense, obviously. And we were helped by one another. And from that point on, I began to see Palestinians differently. So it wasn't another people, it was the same people. It was like being on the same side. And I thought from that point that if we can make encounters of people in similar situations, we can make it more direct and human contact between people. So I think that having people in situations where we're in our humanity at its best.
I totally agree with you. That sounds I think it's interesting that so many moments kind of change. They happen when you're not expecting them, when you're not looking for them. That sounds like one of those. Thanks for sharing, Ilan.
Thank you.
And I saw Lisa raised her hand.
Right. So, David, I also live in Jerusalem, and one of my favorite things to do actually is to go over to East Jerusalem. I happen to go over on Shabbat. I think it's a very appropriate thing. It really adds meaning to my Shabbat, but obviously there are 6 other days of the week if you choose not to go over there on Saturday. And, you know, it's such a vibrant, wonderful place. There are 2 bookstores in particular, the educational bookstore on, what's the name of the street? Maybe Becca, you can help remember, it'll come to me. Salah Din, it's on Salah Din. And then of course, it's sort of brother sister bookstore at the American Colony Hotel. You know, these are sort of places that attract very, very well-educated, open-minded East Jerusalem Palestinians. And I think it's sort of like an engagement light. The other thing that I do that I find, and I've had really, really wonderful, meaningful human engagements with people in East Jerusalem and in both of those bookstores. The other thing that I do is I walk around the outside, not on the walls of the old city, but I walk around the outside of the old city. And of course, as you go around past the New Gate and Damascus Gate, and then coming, I actually like going around the city in a clockwise direction. You run into people and they engage with you. I mean, if you smile and you open yourself up and you have these really sort of very human to human interactions, and they're short, and I've never had an issue that's made me uncomfortable. And maybe you could start small with some steps like that and begin to see that the risks that you take are really not that great. Anyway, just a suggestion from my own experience.
Thanks, Lisa. And if anyone else wants to share kind of a way or a moment in which they felt that was helpful in breaking down fear and breaking down kind of the separation that's created between us, please raise your hand. I think I'm going to say this wrong, but Yokivel.
Yes. I'm 79 years old and I live in Zurich, and I'm a member of the Jewish community, modern Orthodox, but I've worked during 31 years in a medical organization who is supporting primary health care, public health, community health in West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. And I think to do something together is a very useful method to lose fears. I give you an example. There is the Palestinian Medical Relief Society for instance, in Gaza, and my wife and me, we have friends there, and there we can speak. I can speak openly that I'm visiting every Shabbat the Bet Knesset, the synagogue. But if you really respect Palestinian on the eye level, not only as a joke, I mean really eye level, to look in their eyes, I think I could win friends. I'm very thankful for that because they are human beings like me. But I don't know when I have lost my fears. I have a real good Zionist education in Hashomer HaTzair, a leftist organization. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Judy?
Yeah, I want to suggest that there are cities in Israel. It's not only about going to the West Bank and meeting people who are under our occupation, but it's meeting people who live with us. Like I happen to live in Haifa for the last 2 years, and it's like a totally different world because Arabs and Jews are occupying the same space. They're going to the same schools, the same buses, restaurants, hospitals. I mean, it's like, why didn't anybody ever tell me about this? You know, I lived in Jerusalem for about 30 years and then in Tel Aviv for 4 years, but Haifa is like, it's an integrated city. I mean, there's tensions in some places, but it's just astoundingly wonderful and normal. You can feel normal. And it takes a long time to get there to feel that way, but I think it's a good place to start. And then going to visit, you know, the incredibly unfortunate people in the Southern Hebron Hills, you know, that's that's a big leap. But, you know, there's steps that you can do on the way to make it easier.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, one of the things that I think is interesting that you kind of brought up, Judy, that there's kind of Palestinians who are under occupation, but there's also Palestinian citizens of Israel or Arab Israelis, and people prefer different terminology. You know, it's 20% of the country, and the separation doesn't kind of start and end with Israeli Jews on this side of the Green Line and Palestinians on the other side of the Green Line. It's everywhere. And, you know, at Breaking the Silence, we focus on the occupation that started in 1967. But of course, the conflict is much bigger. And I think there's no question, especially when it comes to breaking down separation and breaking down fear. You can't just only look at Palestinians under occupation, right? It's you can't only choose to humanize one group. And we see this in a lot of ways, that people who, you know, focus specifically on issues in society that are intra-societal issues that specifically focus on kind of gaps between the Jewish and Arab groups in Israel, or groups who specifically focus on occupation. And, you know, I think it's a mistake in a way to make that separation as well, because in the end of the day, it's, you know, there's one kind of major group here between the river and the sea, and we're all people. But I will say, and I think kind of this is something that's important to me, and we're going to start wrapping up now because it's late and we've all had a long night. But is that there is an importance, and I think also a responsibility to kind of push ourselves to move past that fear and meet the other. I think it's especially true. I realize that not everyone who's sitting in this chat right now is necessarily Israeli or necessarily even an American Jew, or I say that freely, I mean like from a Jewish community abroad as well. But certainly we have a specific place in this conflict. You know, and when we look into the occupation, I think one of the hardest things in breaking down fear, it's not just fear of the other, it's fear of losing hold of the narrative that we grew up on, that we were raised with, that we know so well. And if I'm being honest, that's scary. Like for me, that was a really painful process to think, wait a minute, some of the stuff that I was taught isn't true. And also that the army that I enlisted, that I did so proudly, that I did so with a real desire and intent to fix the world, one of the things that it does is uphold an occupation in which we control another people, right? And that's not fixing the world. And that's a really difficult, it's really hard to, I think, to come to terms with sometimes our own narratives needing changing with what we grew up on. And so with that being said, I really want to invite all of you to come on a tour with us, Breaking the Silence. We do tours to Hebron and the South Hebron Hills. And I think one of the things that's great about them is that we both give the testimonies of soldiers who served in occupied territories and what it means to carry out these missions on a day-to-day basis, and also a little bit more of an understanding of what the system looks like, but also the opportunity to speak with Palestinian residents, and for the most part, people who are very active in nonviolent organizing. And I believe it's a real privilege to be able to speak to our partners in Hebron and the South Hebron Hills. And I warn you, it will, if you haven't been on one yet, it does kind of push the narrative that we grew up on. It puts holes in it. And I think that's a good thing. And I think that on today, when we're mourning the loss of so many people on both sides, that's exactly the place that we need to be headed in. I want to thank you all so much for joining. You've all been really great. Thank you for participating in the chat. I was not sure if that was going to work, but it did. And thank you for all for those who spoke, and everyone for sharing your thoughts, sharing your time, and being incredibly respectful in the process. And I wish you all a great night, and of course, that we see better and brighter days for this place. I feel incredibly hopeful that they are coming. So thank you.
Just to close off the evening, thank you very much, Becca. It was a really interesting topic, and thank you everyone for participating. And I also want to add our thanks to the hosts of the ceremony and this whole event, which is Combatants for Peace, and the Bereaved Families Forum, Parent Circle, who have done a wonderful job, as they have in previous years. I encourage you all to visit their websites and our website for more information about their work and our work, and about different narratives and different ways of trying to build a better future for this entire area. And there are also, through our website, you can get in touch with us if you have any further questions, or if you want to join us on a tour or to sign up to our newsletter. And I've put links for those things in the chat. Thank you again, and good night to everyone.
Can I tell something?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I'm very connected with Breaking the Silence, and especially with Yehuda Shaul. And in 2015, we have organized, together with Breaking the Silence, a photo exhibition in Zurich, a big one. And there were a lot of visitors, a lot of reactions. And really, I admire your work, your very important work. And it was also interesting what the Chavara has told tonight about her experiences as a soldier, as a shooting instructor. This was very practical, and thank you very much for your work.
Thank you very much for your comments. They really mean a lot to us. Is there anyone else who wanted to say something?
Yeah, basically a question, Joel, maybe you can answer. Kind of, I very often hear from people a little furthest to the right that, like, kind of a humanist Western approach, like what we're doing here, like kind of break the fear and all those things, is a very naive approach and will ultimately be kind of a suicide to what's important to us. And I really don't know what to answer to people who tell me something like that. And I was wondering if you or any one of you could give me some guidance.
That's a great question. I think what that question boils down to is saying that what the status quo, what we have in place at the moment, gives us security, and the alternative is a lack of security. That's the premise of the question. But I would challenge that. I would say, do we really have security now? All of these years that we've been occupying millions of people, they haven't given us security. We still, we still have to live in a certain amount of fear. And on the other side of the green line, there are millions of people who have to live in a lot more fear. And I think it creates a great amount of instability and insecurity for all of us. And the best way of, I think I challenge that by saying, let's see what would happen if we didn't have that same power dynamic. This isn't my evening. I'm not the speaker here, but I happen to be a soldier. I served in COGAT, in a unit which is the coordination of government activities in the territories. And we dealt with basically all of the bureaucracy between Palestinians and like Israel's control of the Palestinians. And I served for a year on the border of Gaza. And in the room across from my office was the office that dealt with what goes in and out, what's allowed to go in and out of Gaza. And this was after the disengagement. And to this day, we control the amount of vegetables that can go through, the amount of chocolate that can go through, all sorts of things. And it really makes you think when you look at these, the way that we manage the Gaza Strip. And just as an example, it makes you ask the question, is this really giving us security? Like deciding that Gazans can only have a certain amount of chocolate and not more, does that give us security? You could ask the same question for the number of miles from the shore of Gaza that fishermen are allowed to go. You know, sometimes if some terrible attack happens, then we'll minimize we'll say fishermen are only allowed to go 6 miles away from the shore, not 9 miles away. And that's the kind of control that we have. And I think it's really important to say that what we have here is, you know, we're talking about occupation, and the occupation is something that Israel has full control over, and Israel has the ability to end. That doesn't necessarily mean that the conflict will be over, and that's something that we both have to work towards. But at the moment, we are creating a situation of great insecurity and instability, and that's my argument, and I guess the argument of breaking the silence would be that we have the power to change that.